Hey friends, I hope your week is off to a great start. Today we're going to be trying out another recipe from Claire Saffitz's cookbook, Dessert Person. Again, headed to the breakfast section for these walnut maple buns. I'm super excited to give this one a go for you all today. I think you all are excited as well because I asked you in last week's poll what recipe you wanted to see next, and the overwhelming majority of you said these buns. If for some reason you missed out on the poll, be sure that you've clicked subscribe and that you've clicked the notification bell and turned on all notifications. That way you'll find out whenever I upload a video or post a poll asking about what recipe you want to see next. So without any further ado, let's get right into this. This recipe starts off with Claire's foundational recipe called her sweet yeasted dough. It's a sweet dough that's yeasted, so it's appropriately named. And to do that, we're going to start off with some activated dry yeast here in a bowl. A word of caution, these envelopes of activated dry yeast hold 2¼ teaspoons. In this recipe, we're using only 1.5 teaspoons. So here in my small bowl, I've got my measured active dry yeast. To that, we're going to add some warm milk. Now, Claire wants this milk heated in a saucepan to 105 degrees Fahrenheit approximately. To save some time, I went ahead and just microwaved this on half power for about 1.5 minutes, and that's brought us up to 107, it looks like. Celsius, that's 42 degrees. So that's exactly what we're looking for. You want it warm enough that you're going to get that yeast activated and moving around. If you go too much over 110, though, you're going to kill the yeast and have nothing happen. So to this, we're going to add about 1/4 cup. It doesn't have to be exactly precise. We're just going to whisk it through. Now, typically when you're reactivating yeast, you'll add some sort of sweetener like honey or sugar. You saw that when we made the no need focaccia, we added honey to that mixture to get the yeast activated and feed it. In this recipe, we're not adding any sugar into this milk mixture. We're gonna let this hang out for about 5 minutes to proof the yeast and just make sure that this gets nice and fragrant and foamy. All right, our yeast is looking nice and foamy. I do wanna call out, this is actually the 3rd time I've made this yeast mixture. The first 2 times I did it exactly as Claire called for in the recipe, no sugar in the milk, and the yeast did not rise or get foamy whatsoever. So I've redone it now the 3rd time. I added a 1/2 teaspoon of the sugar that's called for in the recipe into the milk mixture, and it's nice and foamy. And it's the same exact strip of yeast, so it's the same lot number, same age, etc. So I've got to think that the sugar was the issue. So if you want to be extra safe, just put a little bit of sugar in with the milk and your yeast will be fed appropriately. Not sure what happened. If you have a similar issue, let me know in the comments down below. Really curious if I just have bad luck. Regardless, we are ready to assemble the dough. Here in the bowl of my stand mixer, I've got my AP flour. To that, we're going to add the rest of the granulated sugar along with some kosher salt. Stir this around just quickly. Cool. So now to the flour, we're going to add our unsalted butter. This is chilled directly out of the fridge. I've cut it into 1-inch pieces as the recipe called for. So each piece is about 2 tablespoons. So 10 tablespoons in total, which means 5 pieces. And I'm going to just toss these in flour to get them coated, but we're not breaking them apart. All right, so now making a little well in the center, and now we're going to add in the yeast mixture. We're also adding in the rest of our warm milk. So this has been just hanging out while that yeast was proofing, and 3 eggs. All right, and we are gonna pop on our dough hook, and we're gonna mix this just on low speed until the flour is fully moistened and there are no dry bits hanging out around the edges. So now that the flour is fully moistened, we're gonna crank this up to medium speed, and we're gonna mix this for about 5 minutes until that butter is fully melted. So we've got warm milk that should gradually melt the butter over time and incorporate it into this dough. So we're about halfway through the mixing time, and I can definitely see that the butter is starting to melt. The pieces are still large and noticeable, but they're about half the size that they used to be. All right, so I've been mixing for exactly 5 minutes here, and we've got the right visual cue now. So we've got a really soft, sticky dough. We've got all of the butter melted. It doesn't look smooth. There's kind of this lumpy texture to it. We're gonna do a quick scrape around the bowl just to get everything down. We are gonna now crank this up to medium-high speed for about 5 minutes again. And what we're looking for is for the dough to pull cleanly away from the edges of the bowl while it's mixing. So I've actually owned this mixer for about 6 years. I've never used the dough hook to knead dough before. The only yeasted doughs I've ever made have been the no knead focaccia, which require no kneading, and Sola's cinnamon date sticky buns, which I kneaded by hand. So my mixer's dancing around the counter quite a bit while it's kneading this dough over medium-high speed. If you've made yeasted doughs and kneaded them in your stand mixer, let me know in the comments down below if this dancing situation is normal or if it's my mixer. Curious to hear your feedback. All right, so we've been mixing this for a full 5 minutes. I'm noticing that I'm getting some sticking around the edges of the bowl. What Claire says to do at this point is to add 1 tablespoon of flour at a time and mix it until it no longer sticks to the edge of the bowl. Just 1 tablespoon more of flour. Okay, so now the flour is incorporated. I'm going to crank this up to medium medium, high, and C. Awesome. So a tablespoon isn't a lot of extra flour, but you can see that the difference that it made in this dough really quickly. It's nice and smooth. And the texture here is tacky, but it's not sticky. All right, so we are turning this out onto a lightly floured surface, and we're gonna gather it into a ball, dusting the top with a little extra flour. I've got a 5-quart medium-sized bowl. We're just gonna pop this into the bowl. So I'm gonna let this rise at room temperature for about an hour and a half to 2 hours until it's about 50% larger than it is right now. Our dough has been hanging out at room temperature for just over an hour at this point, and you can see here the size of this is probably a little over 50% larger than it was when we started the rising process. So what we're gonna do at this point is recover this and pop it in the fridge to let it finish rising. The timing here is a minimum of 4 hours. Claire said ideally you would let this hang out in the refrigerator for 8 to 12 hours. So I'm gonna let this just go overnight and then we'll bake this tomorrow. All right, so it is the next morning. Our dough's been in the refrigerator hanging out for about 13 hours at this point. So Claire said 8 to 12 ideally, no more than 16, so we're still in the safety window here. So this morning we've got a few kind of things that we need to prep before we're ready to actually use that dough. So let's get right into it. First thing is gonna be to toast up some walnuts. So I've got whole and half walnuts here on just a small baking tray. I'm gonna pop this into my toaster oven for 8 to 10 minutes, tossing about halfway through. All right, next up is going to be kind of that sticky glaze that goes on the bun. So to do that, we're gonna do a little bit of stove work here. In a small saucepan, I've got 4 tablespoons of butter. To that, I'm adding some pure maple syrup. We're also gonna drop in some light brown sugar. And then either vanilla extract or vanilla bean. I'm choosing to use extract here since there are so many other flavors that are quite strong going on here. I think the vanilla bean is going to get overpowered. And with that, we can pop this on the stove over medium heat and we're just going to bring this up to the boil. So while the nuts are toasting, while that syrup is coming up to the boil, we can go ahead and prep the filling as well. So here in a small bowl, I've got a little bit more light brown sugar along with kosher salt and cardamom. If you don't like the flavor of cardamom, you might want to swap that over to ground cinnamon. In a 1-to-1 swap, and that would be a good alt. And then last here for the filling, we're gonna do some orange zest. So the recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of finely grated orange zest. I like to zest directly into the bowl because as you're scraping, essential oils kind of burst out. So I like to zest downward into the bowl. That does make it a little bit challenging to get 1 teaspoon precisely. So I am just going to kind of keep an eye on it and say probably half of an orange zested is what we're gonna go for. Now with everything in the bowl, we're just gonna pinch this together to get everything really well combined. So this looks good here. You can see, looking at it, the orange zest is kind of evenly distributed through this brown sugar. Obviously you can't see the cardamom since that is brown as well. This is looking great and we can just set it aside until we're ready to use it. And our nuts have been toasting for about 4 to 5 minutes at this point. So I'm gonna go ahead and just toss these around with my spatula just to make sure that they're toasting evenly. So I'm gonna get these back into an even layer and we'll put these in for the final 5 minutes or so. And so then I'm also multitasking a little bit here. I'm just gonna give this a quick stir. The butter is almost fully melted, which makes me think once that butter melts, we're gonna be close to that boil. All right, and this mixture boiled for about 30 seconds. Really no visual indicator. We're not trying to do anything. It was just melted and bring it to a boil. So not terribly interesting. It does smell great though. So here I've got my metal 9x13 pan, and this is not prepped. No butter, no oil, no spray. We're going in plain. It's nonstick, so it should probably be fine. So we're just gonna pour this really hot, recently boiled mixture into the bottom. I love the smell of maple syrup. It's almost breakfast time for me, or I guess it is breakfast time for me, but I haven't had breakfast yet. I was waiting for these to be done. Got the pan all scraped out here. And while the pan is still warm, we have 4 more tablespoons of butter. I'm gonna drop this in here. We're gonna use this butter to brush onto the dough to adhere the filling to it. There's probably enough residual heat in here to carry it over just to ensure that the butter melts fully. I am gonna put this on low just while I'm working with the other ingredients. All right, and so this has been the full 10 minutes here. The nuts are really fragrant. There's definitely been a color change. I don't know if it'll show up on camera or not, but I can tell that the nuts are noticeably darker and they're super, super fragrant. So now what I'm gonna do is just pop these into a Ziploc bag and we'll roll them out just to get them broken up into fine pieces. Let's see how these are looking. Look at Claire's picture for reference. So with the nuts all broken down, we're ready to sprinkle this across this gooey topping. Just try to get an even layer here. Perfect, so we've got all of the prep work done. Now we're ready to break out that dough and get rolling. I would say the size of this is probably about doubled from where we were last night. So it's looking nice and full. So what we need to do is lightly dust the surface with a little bit of flour, and then we're gonna turn this out. Now using the heel of our hand, we're gonna just push this down to kind of degas this a little bit. The dough is quite firm since it's been sitting in the fridge overnight. And now taking the corners, we wanna just kind of stretch this out to kind of an even rectangle shape. Since it's cold, it's gonna be a little bit tight to work with, so let the dough kind of guide you and how much it's willing to move at the moment. We've kind of reached rectangle form. I'm gonna do a little bit of dusting of flour over the top of this. We want to roll this to 9 by 20. So it's already 9 inches wide here. So all of the rolling that we want to do is going to be lengthwise. All right, perfect. So we are at 9.5, 10 inches wide by 20 inches long. So now I'm going to rotate this sideways just so it's a little bit easier to work with. Ultimately, we're going to be rolling it this direction from the long end. So for me, I think that probably is easier to roll this way versus maneuvering sideways. All right, so now we're taking our melted and cooled butter and we're going to brush this across the top of the dough. So we're taking our prepared filling and we're going to sprinkle this evenly across the surface. Claire said to go edge to edge on all 4 sides. Looking at the picture in the book, it seems like she left one of the long edges with maybe a 1/4 inch of no filling so that the dough, when you finish the roll, can stick back onto itself. We did that with the cinnamon date sticky buns from Sola as well. So we're going to roll this from the long side across, and we want to roll this as tightly as possible. Alrighty. And Claire said to let this rest seam side down. So you can tell that our log of dough here, number one, I've got a scraggly end, just like we knew we were going to have. So we're going to have to trim that off on both sides. Also, this log is definitely more narrow over here and a little bit fatter here. So Claire said to go ahead and just kind of zhuzh it around to get it to be a little bit more of a uniform cylindrical shape. We're going to cut about a 1/2 inch off from each end just to get the scraggly bits off. The strategy that Claire has for getting even uniform slices is first to cut this in half and then cut it in half again and then cut it into thirds. We're going in a 4x3 grid. I'm going to reshape them to make sure that they're just nice and round. So this is the area where we didn't put filling. It's stuck itself together really nicely there, and so I think it's going to give us more structural integrity. Everything is evenly spaced in here, so that's looking good. You can tell obviously these outer 3 are a little bit smaller than these inner 3. I do like that moving laterally across the pan, that it is symmetrical, so that feels like a nice aesthetic to have. So next up here, we're going to do another rise. I'm going to loosely cover this with cling film, and we're going to let this rise until it's 50% larger than it is now. So the same idea as yesterday. It should take about 40 minutes or so. So the buns have been rising for about 40 minutes at this point, and I took a before picture so that I could see what the after looks like. So this is about a 50% rise. You can see the gaps between the rolls have really filled in. So I'm feeling great about how these look. I've got my little offcuts here that I'm going to bake up separately because these will definitely need less time to bake versus the full-size rolls. So with that said, I've got my oven preheated to 350 degrees. We're going to pop this in and bake it for 30 to 35 minutes until the surface of the buns is a nice golden brown color. In total, my walnut maple buns baked for 35 minutes. I let them cool in the pan at room temperature for 5 minutes before flipping out onto a wire rack. And this is the end result. So you can see the dough for the buns got nice and light and fluffy. The buns themselves got a nice golden color on the outside. The swirl pattern on the bottom is super well defined. And then the top obviously has the gorgeous crunchy topping. So these look absolutely delicious. Super happy with how they look and how they're smelling. Overall, getting the buns out of the pan was a little bit of a challenge. A lot of my topping got stuck in and I had to pry it out and kind of reposition it. Hence, it looks a little bit messy on the top there. It's not edge to edge like how we wanted. So we've got a few blank spots. So I think the solution for that is to put some butter down, put some parchment down, and then butter that parchment. So if you've made these, let me know whether your nut topping got stuck in the pan or if it came out as you expected it to. But without any further ado, let's give this a try. I'm just dying to dig in, so let's see. Wow, big bite. That orange flavor is coming through really nicely. It's like very fragrant and aromatic. I really like it. The cardamom is not overpowering. I was concerned, given the amount of cardamom we put in here, that it might be too strong. It's perfect. The overall sweetness here is really well balanced. So if you're someone who doesn't like overly sweet breakfasts, this is definitely for you. Texture of the bread is incredible. It's super light and fluffy. So overall, super happy with the walnut maple buns. Not too difficult to pull together, a little bit time consuming because of the proofing of the dough and that whole situation, but definitely worth the while. I really hope you enjoyed this week's video. If you did, please be sure to give me a big thumbs up and click subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week.